Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Holland & Hart's webinar series. My name is Teresa Locke. I'm a partner in the Denver office. And today we're going to talk about drug diversion. We're going to talk about reporting issues, liability issues for physicians, as well as for healthcare facilities. So let's get started. You should have provided to you the slides of today's webinar as well as a few additional documents. The topics that we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about what drug diversion is and why it should matter to healthcare providers, who is liable for drug diversion and what's a provider's role in preventing drug diversion. Then we're going to talk a lot about, throughout this presentation, strategies for prevention, detection, and response to drug diversion issues. We're going to talk some about reporting requirements, HIPAA and privacy issues, and then the last topic is the ACA's impact on drug diversion. As I said, we provided you with the PowerPoint slides, and I think we also provided you with these two documents that are listed on this slide as handouts. I found both of them to be very helpful documents, and I think you will too. The Mayo Clinic document was a little bit hard to find on the internet, so rather than just providing you with the address, we decided to provide you with the document itself. Let me know if you didn't get those, and we can certainly email them to you. So let's first talk about what is drug diversion. Drug diversion is defined by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services as the diversion of licit or legal drugs for illicit or illegal purposes. It involves the diversion of drugs from legal and medically necessary uses toward uses that are illegal and typically not medically authorized or necessary. Who diverts drugs? You may have a stereotype or a thought in your mind of who that might be, but frankly, the deflection of prescription drugs from medical sources into the market may occur at any point in the distribution process, starting with manufacturers who may do counterfeiting or illegal sales, wholesale distributors, obviously doctors, nurses, other staff like technicians, voluntary staff at the hospital, maintenance, housekeeping, patients divert drugs, pharmacists, that's a pretty logical one, other healthcare professionals, and then all the way to the end of the chain, burglars who get prescription drugs illegally. So drug diversion in the healthcare industry is by definition, it's a covert or secretive activity. So the statistics of how much drug diversion is happening in the healthcare facilities or by doctors or healthcare providers is probably underreported and underdetected. But I did find some statistics. The American Nurses Association estimates that 10% of nurses are dependent on some type of drug. The U.S. Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration estimated in 2007, so this is a little bit dated, that an average of 103,000 doctors, nurses, and medical technicians, healthcare aides per year were abusing or were dependent on illicit drugs. That's an astronomical number. If you think about dividing that over our 50 states, that's an astronomical number. Other studies suggest that the number could even be higher than that, again, because it's a covert activity. It's hard to know. It's estimated that 1 in 10 practitioners will fall into drug or alcohol abuse at some point in their lives, which really mirrors the general population. So there's no doubt that drug diversion by healthcare providers is universal in healthcare institutions in the United States, and it's a pervasive problem that we really need to address. The most common types of drug diversion, just to give a little background, most of these I think are common sense, but selling prescription drugs, that's a big industry on the streets these days. Doctor shopping, going around to various doctors until you can get the medications that you want, and maybe going to multiple doctors to get those. Illegal internet pharmacies are now an issue. Drug theft, just sort of in general, drug theft by healthcare professionals or workers. That can involve taking waste, drugs that weren't used, and keeping them for personal use, or stealing controlled substances from the patients, removing controlled substances from automated dispensing machines, especially medications that are used on a as-needed basis. Tampering with the patient's medications, we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So those are all types of drug theft by healthcare professionals. Going back to the topics, prescription pad theft and forgery of prescriptions is common. It can happen by just the general population, but it can also happen within the healthcare industry of nurses, even doctors, forging prescriptions under other doctors' names, and then doctors intentionally illicit prescribing medications when they're not necessary. So we talked about kind of common types of diversion, but what are the drugs that are commonly diverted? According to the DEA, there are 5 classes that have the highest potential for diversion and abuse. That's anabolic steroids like testosterone, central nervous system depressants, barbiturates, hallucinogenic medications, opioids, stimulants. This came from, you can see the site there at the bottom, this came from the Medicare Learning Network as to the 5 most common types. The most common is really the opioid pain relievers. And here's a list of those, codeine, fentanyl, just the usual suspects that you would think of. They're the most common drugs that are diverted. But interestingly, in addition to opioids, significant diversion is occurring with high-cost antipsychotic and mental health drugs, things that lots of people take, lots of teenagers take even, and they're being diverted in schools and other places. According to the Center for Behavioral Health Statistics and Quality, in 2014, this statistic is phenomenal to me. In 2014, the estimate of 6.5 million Americans who are over age 12 who were using prescription psychotherapeutic drugs for non-medical uses represents 2.5% of the population of people aged 12 and older. I think that is a phenomenal statistic and really indicates how prevalent this problem is. So why does it matter? Why do we care about drug diversion? Well, there are lots of consequences to it, and here are 4 general categories of consequences of drug diversion. The first is health consequences. Obviously, there are health consequences to the diverter, the person who's using the medication inappropriately, but if that person is in the healthcare industry and taking the prescription medications from patients, then of course it gives health consequences to the patients, and we'll talk some more about that later on in this presentation as well. So there are health consequences, there are social consequences. Here are a couple of statistics that I think are fairly alarming as well. Since 2009, more people in the U.S. have died each year from drugs than from motor vehicle crashes. And according to the National Drug Intelligence Center in their National Drug Threat Survey, violent and property crime associated with controlled prescription drug diversion and abuse has increased in the last 5 years all over the United States. So there are social consequences from this issue. There are legal consequences. We're going to talk a lot about that today. There's criminal liability and there's civil liability. There's also sort of the regulatory agency side of things, licensing issues that we'll talk about. And then the financial consequences of drug diversion are astronomical. This quote comes from the National Drug Intelligence Center, part of the DEA. The estimated cost of controlled prescription drug diversion and abuse to the public and private medical insurers, so Medicaid, Medicare, and all the private medical insurers, is $72.5 billion with a B dollars a year. And much of that then gets passed on to consumers through higher insurance premiums. Additionally, the abuse of prescription opioids is burdening the budgets of substance abuse treatment providers, and particularly as the prescription opioid abuse might be fueling heroin abuse rates in some areas of the United States. So the financial consequences are phenomenal. So those were just in general sort of what the consequences are. Let's talk about the impact of drug diversion when it's done by a healthcare provider. And we're going to talk about 4 different areas of impact. The first, of course, is to the diverter. There's the risk of morbidity and mortality to himself or herself. Obviously, taking drugs that are not prescribed to the healthcare provider increased risks of harm to themselves. There are professional risks. There's the felony criminal prosecution, civil malpractice, licensing issues, lots of impact on the diverter if and when they're caught. For the patients, the risks or the impact are substandard care. If you've got a healthcare provider that's diverting drugs, then they may be committing malpractice for the patient's care. There's undue pain or anxiety. For example, if the pain medications are being taken by professionals, healthcare professionals, and replaced with saline solution, which is happening all the time. In the news, we read about it all the time, then the patients aren't getting the pain relief they want. Then the huge risk of adulterated or contaminated drugs that are being put in place of the diverted drugs. So when the fentanyl, for example, is being taken out of the syringe and saline is being added and the needle being reused. Here's a statistic or a chart showing various outbreaks associated with drug diversion by healthcare providers in the United States over a 20-year period from, I guess that's a 30-year period over from 83 to 2013, and the various types of problems that are occurring. We see them in the news all of the time nowadays, it seems like, and it's really becoming a problem. So we've talked about the diverter, the patient, coworkers of healthcare providers who divert drugs are at risk. They're at risk of mechanical injury, like with needles and things like that, of medical legal liability. They may be on a team where malpractice is being committed and they get drug into the situation because of that, because of a coworker. There's a risk of disciplinary actions for the fact that they don't report or that there are breaches of policies and procedures. And then the final category of impact is the healthcare institution itself. There's obviously a loss of revenue when drugs are diverted. There's poor work quality, absenteeism, risk of civil liability, the cost of the investigation when diversion is found and there are patients that have been affected and there needs to be letters sent out and remediation done can be astronomical. There's negative publicity associated with it. So there are lots of consequences to the problem. So I want to talk about consequences to prescribers and then legal consequences to the healthcare facilities. For the prescribers, there's been a recent trend towards civil liability for physicians diverting drugs. So it's not just a criminal problem, it can be a civil problem too, and not just malpractice. For example, here's a citation to a case out of West Virginia where the court ruled that substance abusers, the patients, were going to be allowed to sue prescribers and pharmacists who supplied the medications, even though the patient acknowledged that what they were doing was illegal and that they were criminally acquiring these narcotics by misleading physicians and pharmacists, doctor shopping, ingesting the medications in amounts greater than prescribed. So they acknowledged that they were doing that, but the court still said, okay, but we're still going to let you sue the prescribers and pharmacists who supplied the medication for negligence. So if a physician were negligent in prescribing, for example, if they should have known that the patient was lying and might divert the drugs, then they can be liable for damages. That's a huge risk for prescribers. There's also, of course, the risk of criminal liability. Michael Jackson's physician is a prime example. No, it's taken much further than most prosecutions, but Dr. Murray was charged with involuntary manslaughter because he administered the propofol at Jackson's home rather than at a hospital or an outpatient center where the safeguards and monitoring could occur. So while it's a rare thing, because it involves intentional conduct or reckless disregard, it still is happening. And it's more common that there would be medical malpractice, so civil liability. It's believed generally that 1/3 of all physicians in low-risk specialties face at least one medical malpractice claim before they reach age 45, And in 2009, this law review article found that there were 30 cases of criminal prosecutions for this span of time, 81 to 2005. So the risk is a lot less, but it's still a huge risk. And if you're one of those 30 cases of criminal prosecution, then it's just as big of a problem for you as medical malpractice, probably greater. Here are some headlines from recent cases, a couple of them out of Colorado and one elsewhere, but where healthcare providers are being sentenced for theft, sentenced to jail, prison for theft. So there are criminal consequences to drug diversion, obviously. Here's a snapshot from the DEA's webpage. It's, I think, an interesting place to go where you can see criminal cases against doctors, and there's also administrative actions listed there, and just seeing the magnitude of what the problem is. Here's another site, another screenshot from a place where you can find a list of cases against doctors. So I just really want to emphasize how bad the legal consequences can be for drug diversion by prescribers and healthcare professionals. Let's talk about the healthcare facility. So there's also possibilities of criminal liability for the facility where the diversion occurred. Some states make it a crime to fail to report theft or significant loss of a controlled substance, so that's a risk of criminal liability. The DEA is focusing more and more on the organization's responsibility for preventing diversion. They're trying to get back to the root of the problem and really put liability and responsibility on the healthcare facility. The OIG investigations of drug diversions are on the rise. So there's criminal liability. Then naturally there's the possibility of civil liability. Here are some types of claims that could be brought against and have been brought against healthcare facilities for drug diversions: negligent hiring by the hospital, negligent retention, training, supervision, respondeat superior, meaning the hospital is responsible for actions taken by employees when they're doing it in the scope of their employment, so nurses, technicians, et cetera. Reckless and intentional infliction of emotional distress, violations of the Consumer Protection Act. So there's a whole variety of types of causes of actions that can be brought against healthcare facilities in the civil context. There are a couple lawsuits that I'm going to mention here that are fairly recent that have affected Colorado. This first one involves a technician, an operating room technician, who was stealing and using the painkiller fentanyl that was meant for surgery. And she then would fill the syringes with saline, place them back onto the surgery carts, and as a result of that, there were 18 patients that were infected with hepatitis C during surgery. And there was a lot of lawsuit action that came out of that. A very recent one here in Colorado, this was just filed in March of this year, involved same kind of a thing, where a surgical technician was doing the same thing, taking the syringe of pain medication, using it for himself, and refilling it with saline, and exposing patients then to HIV, hepatitis B and C. And the lawsuit was brought against the hospital for inadequate supervision, failure to conduct proper background checks, failure to put safeguards on the drugs, et cetera. So it's a huge issue for facilities, not just for the prescribers. There are regulatory issues as well, so not just criminal and civil issues, but regulatory issues. As you know, hospitals have to be in compliance with federal requirements set forth in the Medicare Conditions of Participation in order to receive Medicare and Medicaid payments. And here are 3 different federal regulations that, as part of the conditions of participation, that are related to drugs, require current and accurate records, require the drugs to be kept in a secure area, and require reports of abuses and losses. So you could lose, health care facilities could lose their ability to participate in Medicare and Medicaid. And then, of course, there are Joint Commission standards that have to be followed as well. I haven't detailed those out in here, but it's important that you understand that those are regulatory issues as well. So understanding now that we have this big problem and that it can really have some significant consequences, what's a provider's role in preventing drug diversion? So the AMA has come up with 4 categories of physicians who misprescribe, starting sort of in unintentional to intentional. And I think it's important to look at these as we start to get into then what we can do to prevent it. We need to understand why it's happening. So the first category is deficient or dated practitioners. They're not keeping up with their CME credits. They're unaware of the controlled drug categories. They don't have a broad knowledge of various medications. They might prescribe for friends or family without a patient record. Again, not doing something that's intentional, but just basically negligent. Unaware of symptoms of addiction. They don't interact with peers. And dangerously, their only education is coming from drug representatives. So that's the first category, just deficient, ill-informed practitioners. Then there's the dupe practitioner, and this is the practitioner who always assumes the best about his patients and is gullible or leaves prescription pads lying around, falls for excuses of I dropped my medication into the toilet or the sink, something like that. They could be kind of a codependent type personality where they can't tell patients no when they ask for narcotics. The third category is deliberate, or the prescriber who is actually becoming a mercenary, who's selling the drugs for money, sex, street drugs, etc. The office becomes a pill factory and prescribes for known addicts who will likely sell the drugs to others. So very much deliberate, but not using the drugs himself, but for other people. And then the last category is the drug-dependent prescriber or the addict. They start by taking the drug samples. They might ask the staff to pick up medications in their name, uses another DEA number, or calls in scripts in the names of family members or fictitious patients and picks them up himself or herself. So recognizing that these are sort of the types of categories where misprescribers fall into, now we need to kind of look at kind of what some of those strategies are that are used by patients to get the drugs. First one, and how we address those. So the first one's doctor shopping, searching for a cooperative professional who will willingly prescribe the medication they want, and or visiting multiple physicians to get as many drugs as possible. So understanding that that is a problem, how do we address it? Well, prescribers should communicate with other providers and pharmacies when there is a suspected issue. Provide better record keeping for controlled substance prescribing. Employ electronic medical records integrated between the pharmacies, hospitals, managed care organizations. And using the prescription drug monitoring program. We're going to talk a lot about that in a few minutes because that is really a way to be able to try to detect when there are diversion issues going on. So that was doctor shopping. Deception, when a patient purposely fakes pain or exaggerates the severity of the pain. How do you address that? Employ more careful scrutiny during patient encounters. Do a thorough history and a first-rate physical examination to try to determine the cause of the pain. Inquire about prescriptions, over-the-counter, and illicit drug use. Another diversion tactic is drug theft. So obvious ways to try to resolve that: keep samples in a locked cabinet. Report the known abuses so that we can stop these from happening. And if the person, the healthcare provider, is the one that's doing it, seek help. Forged or altered prescriptions. Here are some suggestions of ways to address those types of diversion tactics. Family sharing of medications. This statistic is really interesting. Nearly 60% of prescription medications that are used non-medically are obtained from family or friends. either by theft or voluntarily. So it's important that providers, to address this, educate their patients on the dangers of sharing drugs. I think some people don't even understand how dangerous that is. Teach patients how to cope with pain without the use of medications, and stress that doing prescription drugs is the same as using street drugs. CMS offers some recommendations on precautions to take that a prescriber can take to minimize diversion. Some of this is going to kind of be repetitive throughout here, but it's important, I think, that you think of all of these types of things. So these are precautions. Exercise caution with patients, especially those who are requesting a combination of drugs. Document thoroughly when prescribing narcotics or choosing not to. Make sure that there's a paper trail of what you've done so that the next person that looks at the record knows what's happened, knows what your thought process is. Protect your prescription pads. Keep your licensed DEA or license number confidential. Ensure that prescriptions are written clearly so that it's more difficult to forge them. Move to electronic prescribing so that paper prescriptions are not required. Adhere to strict refill policies and educate your staff about that so that when calls come in about refills, that your staff understands what the issues are and what could or couldn't be done. Use the state prescription drug monitoring programs. Refer patients that have extensive pain management problems to specialized practices. Communicate with pharmacists or other providers and collaborate with those providers to try to determine the medical necessity of prescriptions. And then educate your patients on proper disposal of controlled substances. Here's a website there that can also provide you with some proper disposal of controlled substances that you can use with your patients. Prescribing principles, here's some CMS recommendations of prescribing principles to curb diversion. A little bit repetitive, but they're also a little bit different. One, complete a full evaluation and assessment to verify the need for the pain medication. Request a report of the patient's medication history from the database. Screen for substance abuse. Really talk to your patient about the medications they're taking and why they're taking. And prescribe opioids only if alternative therapies do not deliver adequate pain relief. Use pain assessment tools to monitor the effectiveness of the controlled substances. Sorry, I'm having trouble talking. Document your concerns. Again, I said this before, but I'll say it again. Put it in the record for next time so that whatever you're seeing, whatever is happening is there for you the next time or for the next person that's using it. There's a lot of the specialists in this area do suggest that you network with law enforcement as well, because that help is very educational. All right, so now let's talk, we've talked about some strategies, but let's dive in more deeply to diversion prevention, detection, and response. So here's some strategies for diversion prevention with patients. Use screening tools. And, you know, when you're trying to identify potential abusers, you can try to determine what level their risk is. So patients at a low risk need minimal structure, whereas those at the greatest risk need more frequent visits, fewer pills per prescription, specialist level care, drug testing, urine, saliva, hair. If they're at greater risk, so you don't have to treat every patient the same, but you do need to really screen and try to figure out who are at the most risk. There are some screening tools that can be found at this website on this slide that can be used to screen for those risks. I've done a screenshot of one of them in here that is a screening test for adolescent substance abuse, and it's just a mnemonic thing to use, but there are other ones that are available on that website that you can use to really become more proactive in trying to determine patients who might have drug addiction issues. Document every patient encounter. Chart everything you think, see, feel, hear about your patient, and make it so that that entry can stand alone if it's separated from the chart. Have a progress note for every prescription that you write or that's telephoned into a pharmacy, explaining why it's necessary, what the alternatives are, what has been considered, and follow-up plans. Obtain informed consent from your patients. Really have the patient sign so there's no doubt about what the treatment plan is related to these medications. Do not provide automatic refills. No open-ended prescriptions. Make sure that you're seeing the patients when new prescriptions are written, and don't allow your staff to give out prescriptions. So these are some strategies to prevent diversions with patients. This one I think is interesting. Consider universal precautions. This, comes from sort of the infection control people, how they handle things of assuming that every patient might have HIV. Same kind of thing with drug abuse. Recognize that all patients have the potential to get addicted. Some are at higher risk than others, but everybody has that capacity. So assess all patients for past or present drug abuse. Think about the pathology of pain. Routinely use treatment agreements, and I'm going to talk about that more in just a minute. Employ regular supervision and monitoring, and provide extra support for patients that are at risk. It's important to educate your staff about all of these things and to educate your patients. So here's, talking about sort of the treatment agreement or the medication agreement, you might consider having your patient sign a document that states that they will receive medications only from this practice, that they won't obtain drugs via emergency rooms or other doctors. They'll only use one pharmacy. They won't abuse alcohol or other substances. They will adhere to the clinical protocols such as testing and pill counts, et cetera, that they'll keep their scheduled appointments, that they will not share or sell medication, that they understand that lost, stolen, or misplaced medications will not be replaced, or that consideration of replacement would only occur at a clinic visit. They can't just call in. So putting that in writing and having them sign something like that, that they understand that request for medication renewals can only occur during regular business hours and not by phone, and that background checks might be performed. Putting all of this in writing and having them sign this might not stop the hardcore drug users, but it hopefully will educate your patients of the dangers so that they can be more aware of some of the problems and some of the things that they face by taking these highly addictive medications. And if the patient breaches the agreement, then don't prescribe further. So it also gives you an out or a way to cut off prescriptions for patients where you can have an honest conversation with them. Here are some strategies for preventing drug diversion with hospital or healthcare providers. These are things that some of them involve human resources, some of them involve coworkers, et cetera, but conduct background checks. It's amazing how some hospitals have gotten into trouble with healthcare providers, technicians, et cetera, who have had problems in the past that just haven't been detected when they've been hired by the present healthcare facility. So check those things. Develop comprehensive employee screening program. Ask the question, have you ever been disciplined, terminated, allowed to resign, or denied employment because of mishandling of a controlled substance? Even if it doesn't stop you, even if the person lies and it doesn't stop you from employing them, it could help you later from a liability standpoint that you've asked the questions, that you've inquired. You need to develop policies related to drug diversion, and you should work with pharmacy staff and the medical staff to develop protocols for handling of medications. Develop a reporting flow chart. If an employee suspects that there's a diversion problem, who should they report to? That's sort of what that chain of command is. Consider using surveillance technology. With the technology that we have today, cameras can be placed at critical places near the drug dispensary places or in areas that are more vulnerable. Educate and train your employees, not only at the orientation process when they're hired, but periodically thereafter. Have training programs on drug diversion and what to look for. Here's a website from the DEA that has some good materials on it. Those materials can be printed off and placed on bulletin boards, in-service trainings, those kinds of things. Here's another website that I found to be very helpful, this One and Only campaign. Various states have that. This one came from the Colorado's, but it's got posters and flyers and pocket cards and frequently asked questions and checklists and all kinds of things that can be used by a healthcare facility to train their staff and to really bring attention to this. Conduct random compliance checks to see, if the idea is that when practitioners begin diverting drugs and practicing while they're impaired, that one of the first signs, a visible sign, can be sloppy record keeping and lapses in charting. So start looking for those things and do it randomly. Discipline and accountability for violations. Make sure that the employees are aware that there's going to be these random compliance checks so that they, know that you're going to be looking. Make sure there are repercussions for violations of policies. The discipline should be consistent with the seriousness and the frequency of the problem. And there should be continuous accountability and record keeping for drug usage. So put these, make sure that there's accountability there. Another strategy is to verify withdrawals from drug storage against the physician's orders. See if they match. Review record keeping. This could be a problem, a criminal problem, if we don't keep proper records. And consider random drug testing. It's expensive and can't always, not every facility could employ it, but it's recommended, and at a minimum you should do it when there are drugs that are missing. If the employee won't participate, then make that a grounds for dismissal. Think about dividing the duties so that there are some activities that are only two-person activities, wasting of medication or checking out of medication. Make sure that the duties are divided so that it's not one person who's doing the ordering and the putting the drugs away, and so that there's just a broader span so that one person can't keep it in secret. It's got many checks and balances involved in it. Drug counts and audit balances. Perform drug counts and audit balances. And here's a list of things to look for when you're doing the audits, looking for nurses or healthcare providers that are removing controlled substances without a doctor's order, or for patients that are not assigned to that nurse, for removing controlled substances for recently discharged patients. There's kind of a whole list here. I won't go through all of them, but you'll see them in the slides of things to look for when you're doing this auditing to make sure that you're looking for problem areas. So here are some other things to detect. That was prevention. Now we're going to talk about detection of diversion. Utilize a prescription drug monitoring program. We're going to talk about that. All states, almost all states, I think there's only one holdout so far still that don't have this program, but it's an important program that we'll talk about. Involve the entire team, all the way from the receptionist to technicians, to other staff members, nurses, et cetera. Make sure that everybody is aware of what the problem is and what the signs are, and really aware of this and how they can recognize suspicious behavior. Be alert to warning signs. Know the patient's history and family history of drug abuse. Make sure that there's a good history taken. Note whether the patient exhibits apparent behavior, such as requesting early refills, et cetera. Those are things also that your receptionists, people who answer the phone, people who see patients that are checking in can be aware of. Identify manipulative behavior. And then here's a list of behaviors that can be suspicious. And again, you should train your front office personnel about these things too, arriving after regular hours or wanting an appointment toward the end of office hours, stating that he or she's traveling through, visiting friends or relatives, providing convincing textbook-like descriptions of symptoms but giving a very vague medical history, providing old clinical reports or x-rays in support of their request, not wanting to be physically examined, not wanting you to obtain their past records or undergo testing, unwillingness to provide the name of their doctor or stating that the doctor is unavailable, claiming that they've lost a prescription or forgotten to pack their medication, showing an unusual knowledge about opioid medications, stating that there are specific non-opioid medications that won't work for them or that they're allergic to them, or pressuring doctors. These are all sort of red flags. Any one of them in and of themselves, probably not, but a collection are things to look for. Those are with patients, but let's talk about warning signs that might occur in healthcare professionals. Volunteering to administer medications, forgetting to have the waste witnessed when there's medication that's left over. All of these are things to look for. Chronic absenteeism, often without notification. And it's interesting when you look at these kinds of warning signs and then you look at cases that have been brought that have involved drug diversion in cases against hospitals, and a lot of these warning signs were present and they were just ignored. You know, hindsight's always 20/20, but really becoming aware of them and looking for them in advance can make a difference. Here are some more, another list. I'm skipping down just for time purposes, but this interpersonal relations with colleagues, staff, and patients. When those start to suffer, just be aware. And again, when you look back at cases where there have been problems, often that has been a sign that's just been ignored. And this is the last slide on more behaviors to be aware of. Now I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about the prescription drug monitoring programs because they can be really, really helpful in this context. If you don't know what they are, they're electronic databases that collect information about controlled substances and other substances that have been dispensed. Almost all the states have them. You can click on that link there to be able to see where they're at. And they can be either reactive, proactive, or a combination. Reactive is just if you send a request in, they give you a report back. Proactive, PDMPs generate reports based on patterns of behavior that raise red flags, and they provide this data unsolicited. So those are really good to have. Here's a website where you can go, and I think this website's great, so I put the address up here. You can click on your state and see a summary of the PDMP program, when it was enacted, who runs it, all kinds of information that's on there. The AMA tells us, really touts the benefits of using these PDMP programs. You can access a patient's prescription history for opioids and other controlled substances quickly during the patient encounter. You can determine whether they've received controlled substances from other providers or other pharmacies, if you're a pharmacist. You can evaluate and manage your patients with persistent pain more effectively, create alerts for when a patient reaches a certain level, like, for example, a number of prescriptions or a different number of different types of prescriptions, so that there can be kind of red flags to look out for those things. You can identify the need to counsel the patient. You can work with other prescribers, et cetera. So they're really, the AMA recognizes the benefits of that program. CMS also recommends considering the following actions to maximize the efficiency and the effectiveness of the PDMP. So some recommendations that CMS gives are becoming familiar with your state-specific compliance and reporting requirements and following them. Offer training to qualified personnel so that this becomes a part of the process. Incorporate the database screening into workflow schematics and integrate monitoring into voluntary comprehensive compliance programs. So these are some things that can give you the most out of these programs. All right, so we've talked about preventing them and detecting them. Now let's talk about what you do if you suspect that there's a diversion problem. So for providers, it's important to stay abreast of change, to have training in pain management and addiction issues. According to the AMA and the Office of National Drug Control Policy, only 19% of physicians receive training in prescription drug diversion in medical schools. So really becoming educated by attending seminars and reading current literature, et cetera, is important. Another thing is reporting non-medical drug use. We're going to talk about reporting more specifically in a minute, but that's another one. Address substance issues with patients. Be respectful but firm, and really have a dialogue with your patients about drug abuse and the risks involved with the medications that you're prescribing, and enforce medication agreements. So what can facilities do when, what should their response to be? Well, again, you need to educate your employees, because your employees are required to make, where employees have knowledge of illegal drug activity, they're expected to be mandatory reporters. And so as an employer, you're required to make your employees aware of this regulation. Let your employees know that the hospital's overall operation and liabilities are more important than one individual, a coworker, or someone that they see diverting drugs, and that the hospital cannot afford to be placed at risk by people violating drug laws. Then you should let your employees know that violating the laws or the policies, that they have repercussions. If you suspect drug diversion from an employee, immediately remove that person from patient contact. Notify whoever's keeping the drugs, if it's if you have a pharmacy there in your hospital or your healthcare facility, make sure that they understand that that employee is suspended and not able to access the drugs. And then conduct a diversion investigation. Document everything. Probably at this point, may want to get a lawyer involved as well. You need to think about suspending the employee, not only removing them from patient contact, but should you suspend them? You need to thoroughly interview the staff who made the report. You need to audit the drugs, review records. Then after you've audited the drugs and reviewed the records, interview the suspected diverter. Test the explanation that that person gives you as to what the excuse that they come up with. Consider drug testing. Involve your risk management department. Expand your review of transactions if necessary. So if it's suspected in one place, do you need to look at that provider's records more thoroughly and see if there are other issues that are coming up, if there's a pattern, and keep track of the expenses of the investigation, because it may be something that you want to seek reimbursement from the diverter for. Then another response is that we have to report non-medical drug use to relevant authorities, law enforcement. DEA is the big one here. There's regulations that require reporting of theft or of significant loss of controlled substances within one day. It should be done. There's a website there. Licensing agencies. Most states require mandatory reporting if it's a healthcare provider that's licensed. Then there's, of course, the OIG and reporting to them. Another response, you have to determine, after you've done your investigation, do you suspend the employee for a specific period of time? Do you fire them? What is the disposition going to be? Consider the billing implications that are caused by the diversion. You may need to rebill if drugs have been taken and billed to the patient that weren't used by the patient. Notify the patients if necessary. For example, if it was if it was one of these instances for when there's a syringe that's being used that may be contaminated. Ensure that you have hospital representation on medical staff and peer review entities that are looking at healthcare providers that are doing the diversion. Ensure consistent treatment as far as, if you suspect a diversion, treat all of the suspects the same. Include language in hospital contracts requiring notification of impairment or disciplinary issues. Review employees that are on probation or being monitored by licensing board. Review them more carefully. Keep an eye on that. And if diversion involves medications that are administered with syringes, you have the infectious disease issues that need to be considered. And then consider pursuing action against the diverter to recover your losses because it's an expensive process. The Mayo Clinic has produced this sort of best practices 77 points to look at related to controlled substance diversion detection and prevention programs. We've provided that as a handout to you today, and it's, I think, a really thorough place to begin to determine whether you have the right policies in place. There's another publication that was put out by the Mayo Clinic that they suggest 10 ways to halt drug diversion by healthcare workers. And I think this is a fantastic list, and so I've listed all of them here and wanted to just briefly go over them with you. One, have a zero tolerance policy. That's fairly self-explanatory, but make sure that your workers know that this is so serious that they'll lose their jobs and that they'll be reported to appropriate authorities if they don't, if they are involved in any way in drug diversion. Number two, make friends with law enforcement agencies such as U.S. drug enforcement officials and your local law enforcement agency so that you have a way to really quickly act. Number three, employ a 24-hour diversion hotline for workers to report suspicious behavior. It's probably only viable for larger facilities, and it's obviously expensive, but it does show that you are really taking this seriously so that it's more defensible for your lawyers later and hopefully really is being used by the workers to protect patients. Assemble a team similar to the Mayo Clinic's DDIRT team, and if you Google DDIRT, you can read lots and lots about the Mayo Clinic's program, and it would take a whole webinar to talk about their program in particular, and it's probably cost prohibitive for a lot of facilities, but it's certainly something to look at and determine what you can and can't afford to do. Employ a waste retrieval system everywhere that injectable opioids are used in patient care. And that kind of goes back also to the surveillance that we talked about, but another thing to look at on that waste retrieval system is to do random checks of syringes to make sure that they're, filled with the drug that they're supposed to be filled with. Throw out assumptions about healthcare workers who divert drugs. I mean, there are assumptions such as, they're easy to notice because of odd behaviors. That's just not true. Some might be easy to notice, but people who do this are likely very covert in what they're doing, so it can happen to anybody. And another assumption is that only workers with access to drugs divert them. That's not true. There are technicians, janitors, lab technicians. They're all over the place, so you cannot just assume that it's only one category. Know and keep track of areas throughout your organization that are the most vulnerable. Really keep a better eye on those. Report drug diversion. Have that in your policy so that everyone knows it. The 9th list of best practices by Mayo Clinic is make sure that the hospital leaders understand that as healthcare systems get better at creating barriers to theft, the theft will happen closer and closer to patient care. So policies have to really be evolving to make sure that you're covering all of the areas. And then if an employee is caught, offer treatment to them, try to help solve the underlying problem. Those top 10 best practices can be found at the website that I've cited there. I just think they're really good and worth looking at. All right, let's talk quickly about reporting requirements. There's two types of reporting, sort of internal reporting and then external reporting. So internal, you need to have a process in place. We talked about earlier sort of like the chain of command and who reports to whom, but we need to make sure that suspected impairment or diversion be reported. If they have a good faith basis to think that it's happening, then they should report it. And they should understand, your employees should understand that those concerns will be taken seriously and confidentially. So here are some reasons why many employees don't report about coworkers. They're uncertain, or they just can't believe that that would happen, or they intentionally turn a blind eye. They hope the problem will go away, that it's an isolated event, or they're concerned about what getting involved will mean to them. And so you have to really talk through those issues with your employees and make sure that, again, that they understand the significance and the importance of doing this. And understanding that failure to reporting really enables the diverter to keep doing it and can cause problems for patients and for the facility. Then the prescribing physician should be familiar with federal and state prescribing laws so that they understand when they should report things. The facility providers, there's a duty to report theft of controlled substances to the DEA immediately. That's extremely important. Then there are other areas where there may need to be reporting. State licensure board, again, most states make that mandatory. Local crime or local law enforcement, some states make it mandatory to report a crime. So you need to understand what your local laws are. The state pharmacy board will likely need to be a report made to them. Possibly the FDA, depending on what has been diverted, the OIG, state Medicaid fraud control unit. So these are all areas that there may be a need to report depending on the laws. All right, we only have a few minutes left, so I want to quickly go through HIPAA and privacy issues. We've had lots of webinars on HIPAA and privacy, but how does that intersect with reporting? Well, first of all, let's talk about the privilege, this doctor-patient privilege that's out there in states. You need to be clear that information communicated to a physician in an effort to procure unlawfully a prescription drug is not a privileged communication. So you're not bound by the physician-patient relationship when somebody is trying to commit a crime. There's not an obligation to report that as far as this privilege is concerned, but you're not prohibited from disclosing it. Under the HIPAA laws and privacy laws, a covered entity may disclose protected health information without receiving the permission of the individual for national priority purposes, including these four things: disclosures required by law, so if the laws require it, if it's a public health activity, health oversight activity, and law enforcement. HIPAA also allows disclosures for treatment, payment, and health operations, and these health operations include quality assessment and improvement activities, and fraud and abuse detection and compliance activities. So HIPAA has exceptions for being able to report drug diversion. The important thing that you have to remember, though, still is that you still have to limit what you disclose to the minimally necessary to accomplish the intended purpose. So you can't disclose the entire chart. You can only disclose what's minimally necessary to report. Now, some state laws have mandatory reporting. We've talked about that a little bit. Generally, HIPAA preempts contrary state laws. However, HIPAA identifies several exceptions. So if there's a contrary state law, it will not be preempted if these exceptions occur. One is that it's necessary to prevent fraud and abuse related to the provision or payment for health care, or if the purpose is to serve a compelling need related to public health, then no matter what HIPAA says, if a state law mandates reporting, then you must report. If it has its principal purpose, if the state law has its principal purpose to regulate the manufacture, registration, distribution, dispensing, or other control of any controlled substance. That's exactly what we're talking about. Or to, if the state law provides for reporting of disease or injury, et cetera. So again, HIPAA, while it is concerning, there are exceptions, and you should keep that in mind. You should consult a lawyer if you're not sure about what should or shouldn't be reported. And then we're almost out of time. I saved this for last, and I'm not even sure, given Tuesday's election, how relevant this will be in the future. But the Affordable Care Act also has impacted a little bit the drug diversion issue. And the ACA grants states significant new authority to fight fraud and abuse in the area of drug diversion, including the ability to establish enhanced oversight for new providers, establish periods of enrollment moratoria or other limits on providers identified as being high risk for fraud and abuse, establish enhanced provider screening, and require states to suspend payment when there is a credible allegation of fraud, which may include evidence of overprescribing or overutilization or questionable medical necessity. So the Affordable Care Act does have some, carries some bigger sticks now than used to be the case. It provides more stringent penalties for submitting false claims and false statements, and that includes knowingly submitting false information related to drugs. I said this just a minute ago on the other slide, but requires state Medicaid agencies to suspend payments automatically for physicians and other providers who have credible allegations of fraud, and requires that if providers are terminated for cause by Medicare or any Medicaid agency, they must be terminated by Medicaid and the CHIP programs in all states. So big consequences to it. All right, well, we're out of time. Here are some additional resources that I found very helpful. I've tried to put the website on there so that you can look at them and read them. I would encourage you, I cribbed a lot of stuff in this presentation from these, so I would encourage you to take a look at those as you're trying to develop policies, et cetera. I'll just tout our website that we have lots of resources, not so much on this topic, but on lots of topics available. And we have these webinar series a couple of times a month. And we also provide healthcare updates and our blog. Feel free to send me an email. If you have a question, since we're out of time, I do see that there is a question on here. Piper, I'll answer your question by email after this presentation. So hope you all enjoyed this and look forward to participating with you again in the future.